Hey guys, you're back. Or maybe this is your first time. Either way, welcome. Tonight, we wandered gently into the life of a barber in 13th to 15th century of medieval times. But before that, I'm just going to ask what time is it where you are? midnight in Michigan? 2 a.m. in London? Or maybe you're just drifting off in a quiet corner of Manila as the city hum fades into nothing. Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. And before your eyes grow too heavy, before your thoughts begin to melt into dreams, please take a moment, just a moment, to subscribe, so that next time sleep won't have to wait for you to find your way back. Now then, the light is dim, the world outside is quiet, and here, tucked between the folds of old parchment and fading memory, a forgotten story stirs once more. Barber role in medieval times, 13th to 15th century Europe. In the medieval world, the term barber meant something very different than it does today. A barber wasn't simply a man with scissors and a comb, he was also a surgeon, a tooth puller, a bloodletter, and sometimes even a minor physician. These men were known as barber surgeons, practical tradesmen who worked where university-trained physicians would not. Most commoners couldn't afford or access scholarly doctors, but they could visit their local barber. He was part healer, part craftsman, often more trusted than the learned man in robes who spoke Latin and charged in silver. Step into a medieval barber's shop, and you wouldn't just find chairs and mirrors. You'd hear the scrape of a blade against a whetstone. You'd see small basins of water being warmed over a fire, cloth towels soaking, and the walls lined with tools of many kinds. There would be scissors, razors, tweezers, hooks, scalpels, and tooth-extracting tongs. And just beside them, pots of beeswax for mustaches, herbs for poultices, leeches for bloodletting, and sometimes even prayer beads. The air would smell of lard soap, cloves, damp cloth, and ash. Clients sat on wooden stools or benches, often wrapped in old linen, while others waited their turn, chatting softly or listening to local news, whispered across the blade. A barber's day began early. He would warm his razors in hot water to soften the blade. Then he'd sweep the shop floor, prepare his towels, and lay out his tools with care. The first clients often came just after dawn. Farmers needing a trim before market, monks from the abbey needing a beard shave, or even a knight requesting a cleaner cut before seeing a noble. But the barber's tasks went beyond grooming. Shaving beards and trimming hair, lancing boils and abscesses, pulling rotten teeth, cauterizing wounds, bandaging injuries, applying leeches to balance the humors, and performing bloodletting to drain bad blood. In rural villages, a barber might be the only form of medical care available. If you've ever wondered about the red and white striped barber pole, it dates to this very era. The red represented blood, the white represented the bandage, and sometimes a blue stripe symbolized veins. Outside a barber's shop, this pole spun slowly in the breeze, a signal to all that bloodletting services were offered within. The barber would tie a strip of cloth around a patient's arm, use a small lancet or blade to cut a vein, and let the blood flow into a shallow bowl. Some believed this released bad humors or cured headaches, fevers, and even melancholy. It was messy, risky, and often done without pain relief, but it was common. By the 13th century, barbers were gradually separated into two ranks in many European cities. Barber surgeons performed minor surgeries and procedures. Guild barbers focused on haircuts, shaves, and external grooming. In places like France and England, the barber surgeon guild became quite powerful, sometimes working alongside physicians, but often viewed as craftsmen, practical, hands-on, and indispensable to the poor and working class. They might set a broken bone, lance a cyst, or dress a deep cut, but rarely would they open a body or perform internal surgeries. That was left to the realm of licensed surgeons or those working under church supervision. A barber often learned through apprenticeship, starting as a young boy sweeping floors, sharpening blades, and boiling cloth. Over years, he'd be allowed to shave clients, then assist in small procedures under supervision. Tools were kept in linen rolls or wooden chests, carefully cleaned, though not sterilized by modern standards. Razor blades were honed daily. Bandages were reused, sometimes soaked in vinegar or wine to clean them. Herbs were also part of his kit. sage for infection, nettle for circulation, comfrey for wounds. Though not an herbalist by trade, a barber knew enough to mix simple salves and boiling poultices. Barbers were often well-liked, especially by villagers and common folk. They were affordable, available, and personable. Unlike noble physicians, the barber knew your name, and perhaps your grandfather's name too. He might treat you, your wife, your child, and your horse, all in one morning. Some worked alone. Others set up next to bathhouses. In towns, they might pay guild dues and operate alongside apothecaries and bone setters. In castles, barbers might serve noble houses, shaving knights, tending to wounds, and keeping hair tidy for court. In the gilded halls of medieval courts, barbers held a curious place. They were both servant and artisan, invisible yet essential. A nobleman, whether knight, bishop, or king, would not present himself to the world without the practiced hand of a barber. A clean shave, a tamed beard, or neatly trimmed hair was not merely a matter of hygiene. It was a mark of dignity, discipline, and power. And so the barber was admitted into intimate spaces, royal bedchambers, private baths, campaign tents. He might not speak unless spoken to, but he saw and heard much. Many barbers served one noble family for life, becoming trusted enough to handle the king's throat with a razor edge. A nobleman might say little to his barber, but he would not do without him. Some kings, like Henry IV of England or Louis XI of France, retained full-time barber surgeons at court. These men not only shaved and cut hair, but also treated wounds, pulled teeth, drained abscesses, and dressed the injuries of war. To be a barber in the royal household was a steady living and a respected post, but still firmly beneath the court physician in status. He wore clean robes, but not silk. He walked the halls, but behind others. He spoke softly and always bowed. In the towns, among merchants, millers, scribes, and tanners, the barber was a familiar and necessary figure, one part craftsman, one part comfort. For the townswoman with an aching jaw, he was the man who pulled the infected tooth with a steady hand. For the baker, he cleaned wounds burned by fire. For the priest, he shaved the tonsure in the back of the head, just so. They spoke to him plainly, sometimes with gratitude, sometimes with complaints, but they paid in coin and expected his tools to be sharp and his rags clean. He was not highborn, but neither was he low. He was a tradesman, a guild member, and in some cities, barbers even ran multiple chair shops where apprentices learned under their eyes. Their standing was roughly equal to a blacksmith, tailor, or baker, respectable, needed, and woven into the everyday fabric of urban life. If he worked near a bathhouse, his shop was busy. If he traveled with fairs or markets, he earned his living on the road. And if he served well, he was often repaid in loyalty and steady custom. In the countryside, where no court physicians walked and no university Latin was spoken, the barber was everything. To a poor farmer or shepherd, he was not only the man who shaved his face, but also the man who bandaged the sick child, drained the swollen limb, and stitched the wound from a harvest scythe. He was paid not in silver, but in bread, eggs, candles, or bundles of herbs. His tools were fewer, his rags are older, but his work was the same and often more intimate, more appreciated. In some villages, the barber might be one of the only men who could read or write. He might even serve as messenger, record keeper, or midwife's helper. To the common folk, he was both healer and hair cutter, but above all, present. He knew their families, he saw them, he treated their wounds in silence and gave them comfort without a sermon. No courtly thanks, no gilded coin, but perhaps a warm loaf and a whispered, "Bless you, brother." Whether standing behind a king's golden mirror, working beside a merchant's tiled bath, or crouching in a mud-bricked cottage, the barber held the same blade, steady, worn, and familiar. He asked little, he carried much, and across classes and kingdoms, he was one of the few who touched the body, calmed the nerves, and gave relief in a world of fevers and fears. He may never have worn a crown or held a seal, but he held trust. And in the still, quiet rooms of history, sometimes that is worth more than either. By nightfall, the barber cleaned his blades again, soaking them in wine or water, wiping them with oiled cloth. Bloodied rags were hung out to dry or buried. The fire in his heart dimmed. He swept the floor and counted coins, usually copper or pewter. In a small village, his work was never done. A knock at his door at midnight might mean a woman in labor, a stable boy with a gash, or a traveler with aching teeth. And in such moments, despite no degree and no title, the barber stood as healer, with blade, rag, and steady hands.
In the medieval world, before books were common and theaters were grand, stories moved with the wind, carried not by pages, but by people. And chief among them was the minstrel, the wandering voice of the Middle Ages. He was not merely a musician, he was a poet, jester, singer, and historian, a bringer of tales to those who could not read and laughter to those who forgot how. Some were called buskers, performing in streets and marketplaces. Others entertained in great halls or noble courts. But all shared one thing. They lived by the rhythm of the road and the weight of a well-remembered song. The minstrel's life was not rooted, it was one of travel. With lute on his back or drum at his side, he wandered from village to town, castle to tavern. Sometimes alone, sometimes in troops, always listening, watching, remembering. In one town he might perform in a bustling square. In another he might play for bread at the inn, or for a coin tossed kindly into his cap. His world was a patchwork of paths and people, melodies and mead. The road was his true home, paved not with stones, but with stories. A minstrel woke not with the sun, but with the stir of a crowd. He might begin his morning tuning strings or oiling a flute, rehearsing verses remembered from a dozen towns before. Daily tasks might include performing music in marketplaces or churchyards, singing tales of ancient heroes and recent kings, reciting poetry or humorous rhymes, playing instruments, lute, harp, fiddle, flute, drum, juggling, miming, or storytelling for children, composing new verses from local gossip, serving as herald or announcer in noble courts. He was part entertainer, part news-bearer, and part mirror to the world he wandered through. Minstrels told more than stories. They preserved memory. They sang of Charlemagne and Arthur, of Roland and Beowulf, of saints and sinners, of wars fought far away, of love gained and often lost. Through rhyme and rhythm they made history into song. Even battles and plagues, grief and famine could be softened in the telling. Some songs were bawdy and jolly, others are sacred and solemn, and in between were ballads, long, sorrowful tales sung under moonlight to hearts that needed them. In a time of hardship, the minstrel's voice was a gentle escape. The life of a minstrel could rise or fall with a single performance. Some were street buskers, scratching a living among traders and townsfolk. Others were lucky, hired as court minstrels, adorned in fine tunics, playing before dukes and ladies by candlelight. In great halls, they were welcomed with food, wine, and coins. Some even traveled with noble households, composing songs to mark weddings, births, or victories. But even the grandest could fall out of favor. The road was always waiting, a dusty companion for the forgotten voice. And so the minstrel learned to be both proud and humble, regal in court, ragged in the square. No university taught minstrelsy. It was learned by ear, by heart, by wandering. A young boy might follow an older minstrel, learning ballads verse by verse, practicing lute by moonlight, memorizing stories one tale at a time. Instruments varied. Some owned carved harps or fine viols, others just whistles and drums. The voice was always the core, trained to carry over wind, crowd, and clinking cups. Tools of the trade included a lute or harp slung in linen, bells on the belt for rhythm, a pouch for coins or bread, a repertoire of dozens, if not hundreds, of songs, a warm cloak, for not every night had shelter. Minstrels were both loved and overlooked. To peasants, they were joy bringers. A minstrel's arrival brought laughter, dancing, and sometimes tears. Children followed them in the streets. Elders gave them bread for tales of yesteryear. To nobles, they were ornaments, charming but temporary, valued but never quite equal. The church viewed them warily, suspecting vanity and mischief. Some minstrels told ribald tales or mocked hypocrisy. Others composed hymns and spiritual songs, earning pious favor. No matter the view, their place was always on the edge, not quite within the circle, yet never fully outside. As twilight fell, the minstrel sought his evening's stage. A firelit inn, a noble's feast, a quiet square beneath the stars. He played until voices softened and heads nodded, and as people slept, dreaming of dragons or faraway queens, he gathered his cloak and coins, tucked his lute under one arm, and moved on. Sometimes toward warmth, sometimes into rain, but always forward, chasing the next crowd, the next song, the next flicker of wonder in a stranger's eyes. His name was rarely written, his face seldom remembered, but his voice lingered, in the melody hummed by a child, in the tale passed from mouth to mouth, in the smile of a stranger beneath the stars. He was the music in silence, the joy in sorrow, the story in song. Half poet, half vagabond, a light-footed soul wandering through history, a bringer of memory wrapped in rhyme. And though his steps have long faded, the echoes of his song still dance, wherever people gathered to listen and wonder.
In the medieval world, the art of scent was not just for pleasure. It was medicine, protection, devotion, and sometimes power. A perfumer wasn't merely someone who made people smell pleasant. He was part alchemist, part apothecary, part artisan. He distilled herbs and resins, imported rare oils, and crafted blends that might grace a queen's pillow or a bishop's chamber. Fragrance was believed to ward off illness and evil. Where filth and plague festered, sweet smells offered comfort and a sense of safety. Perfume was more than luxury, it was survival. Step inside a medieval perfumer's workshop, a narrow room, perhaps above a shop or within the walls of a noble estate. Shelves lined with glass and clay vessels, jars of dried petals, bark, gums, and wax. A still, gently puffing steam through a copper coil. Mortars, pestles, and knives laid carefully beside folded cloths and charcoal burners. You'd smell rose, sandalwood, and camphor. You'd hear the soft bubbling of oils and the rasp of a pestle grinding resin. Sometimes the air was so thick with scent, it clung to your hair for days. It was a place of transformation, where rough roots and faded flowers became elixirs, incense, and oils. The perfumer rose early, for time was needed to steep, distill, and blend. He would inspect petals drying from the previous day. He'd heat oils, strain tinctures, and fan slow-burning incense over trays of spices, saffron, cinnamon, and frankincense. Tasks of the day included preparing scented oils for the skin and hair, mixing floral waters for nobility, creating pomanders, small balls of wax and perfume worn to mask odors, brewing fragrant vinegar to ward off plague, crafting incense for chapels or noble halls, sealing bottles with wax and parchment. The work was slow and exacting. A single mistake in temperature or timing could ruin a week's labor. Scent, in the medieval mind, wasn't just physical. It touched the soul.
Churches burned incense to carry prayers heavenward. Monarchs carried perfumed clothes to cover their noses during illness or war. Lovers exchanged embroidered sachets filled with lavender and thyme. Even the dead were perfumed, wrapped in scented cloths before burial, a gesture of dignity and love. And in times of plague, physicians wore beaked masks filled with herbs and perfumes, believing the fragrance purified the air. To create a perfume was to offer healing, pleasure, and protection, all from a single vial. Perfume was a treasure of the elite. Nobles paid dearly for imported resins from Arabia, roses from Damascus, or ambergris washed from the sea. Queens ordered personalized fragrances, jasmine for softness, myrrh for mystery. Kings kept perfumers at court. They prepared scents for robes, gloves, bedding, and even armor. A monarch might enter a hall trailing frankincense and civet, announcing his presence not by voice, but aroma. And in cathedrals, perfumers worked alongside clergy, scenting relics, vestments, and altars with holy blends of spikenard, galbanum, and rose. The perfumer held no title, yet he moved among princes and priests, his art inhaled in silence. Becoming a perfumer took years. A boy might start as an assistant to an apothecary or spice trader. He would learn to identify herbs by scent, to measure with precision, to heat without burning. He'd practice distillation, often over open flame, and keep notebooks in cramped script, formulas passed down like sacred texts. Tools of the trade included alembics and stills, mortars of marble or bronze sieves and cloth filters, glass droppers and beeswax seals, scales so sensitive they could weigh a single petal. He'd also study the stars, for some believed that certain scents must be gathered when specific planets ruled the sky.
In medieval times, before gas and electricity, before oil lamps lined streets or hearths hummed with switches, there was the chandler, a maker of light in a world ruled by shadow. But Chandler was not merely a candle maker. He was also a wax melter, tallow renderer, supplier of oils and wicks, a quiet tradesman whose work illuminated chapels, castles, and cottages alike. To bring light was no small task. It was a craft of patience, fire, and fragrance, often unpleasant, sometimes dangerous, always essential. Step inside a chandler's shop, and you'd enter a place of flicker and flame. Cauldrons of fat bubbling over coals, wooden racks draped with cooling candles, shelves stacked with beeswax, pots of tallow, skeins of linen thread, and iron ladles blackened with soot. The air was heavy, sometimes sweet with beeswax, other times acrid with the reek of animal fat. The floor was streaked with drips of wax, and everything, the benches, the tools, the man himself, bore traces of oil and smoke. It was not a place of beauty, but it was where light was born. A chandler's day began before the sun, ironic perhaps, for a man who made his living by darkness. He would heat his cauldrons and check his molds. Tallow had to be melted slowly, skimmed off impurities. Beeswax had to be softened just right, too hot and it cracked, too cool and it refused the wick. His daily work included rendering tallow from animal fat, filtering and melting beeswax, twisting and cutting linen wicks, dipping candles in repeated cycles, up to 40 times, pouring into clay or metal molds for uniform shapes, trimming and bundling cooled candles, preparing rush lights and oil lamps for the poor. Each candle took time, layers added slowly, evenly, by hand. It was slow, repetitive, and hot work, but in the end, it yielded something precious. Not all candles were equal. The poor burned tallow, made from sheep or cow fat. It smoked, smelled foul, and burned quickly, but it was cheap. The wealthy used beeswax, sweet-smelling, cleaner, longer-lasting. These candles graced the altars of cathedrals, the halls of kings, the boudoirs of noble ladies. In churches, candles weren't just light, they were offerings. Each flame is a prayer rising heavenward. Some monasteries kept their own chandlers, tasked with maintaining sacred lights that never went out, burning before relics, saints, and altars without pause. The chandler served all walks of life. He might craft a towering beeswax taper for a cathedral's Easter vigil one morning, and that evening twist humble rushes in fat for a peasant woman preparing stew in the dark. In castles, chandlers worked in teams. They filled iron chandeliers, cleaned wax from silver holders, and ensured the evening's feasts glowed golden. A noble might request perfumed candles, scented with rose or sandalwood. A physician might request hollow tapers filled with herbs for fumigation. Even executioners needed light for late-night duties. And in towns, chandos often rented candles for events, charging not by the candle, but by the hour it burned. Most chandlers learned by apprenticeship, beginning young, sweeping floors, preparing molds, and watching the slow art of dipping. Tools of the trade included iron pots and bronze ladles, molds of clay, tin, or wood, knife to trim wicks, boards and racks for drying, parchment seals and wax stamps for custom orders. They also knew recipes by memory, how to purify fat with ashes, how to dye wax with plant dyes, how to send candles with herbs or oils. Their work required patience, but also precision. An uneven candle could lean, flicker, or drip, and in great halls, fire from a single mishap could cost lives. Chandlers were not always beloved, especially by neighbors. The smell of tallow was infamous. In towns, tallow rendering was often banned within city walls. Many chandlers worked on the outskirts or near rivers where waste could be carried away. But despite the odor, they were respected. Churches relied on them. Merchants depended on them. Noble households could not dine or entertain without them. In guild cities, chandlers formed powerful brotherhoods, regulating wax prices, inspecting quality, and defending their rights with pride. A master chandler was known by the smoothness of his taper, the strength of his wick, and the steadiness of his flame. As the sun set, the chandler wiped his tools with ash and cloth. He bundled cooled candles in twine, sealed wax blocks for trade, and banked the fire for the night. A quiet glow still flickered from the racks, soft flames trembling in the gloom. Perhaps he carried a bundle of tapers to the church, or left a single rushlight burning in the window for a traveler's path. And as the village darkened, it was his hand, unseen, unthanked, that gave it light. In the shadows of castles and cottages, chapels and kitchens, the chandler worked, unseen but essential. A bringer of warmth, a keeper of flame. A humble figure in sooty apron and wax-stained hands, illuminating prayers, meals, births, and deaths. Though the world now glows with glass and wire, the memory of his light lingers. In every candle flicker, in every scented flame, in every quiet room made gentle by a single trembling wick. Half craftsman, half guardian of the night, a quiet servant of the dark.
In an age before engines and asphalt, before iron rails and paved roads, the wheel was life. And behind every strong wheel stood a quiet craftsman, the wheelwright. He was not just a carpenter, nor merely a smith. He was a master of movement, balance, and precision. A wheelwright built the parts that carried everything, from the humble farmer's cart to the royal coach of kings. His work didn't gallop like the knight, nor sing like the minstrel. It turned, slowly and surely, shaping the rhythm of daily life. Step into a wheelwright's yard, and you'd find the smell of oak shavings in the air, the ring of hammer on iron, and great wooden circles leaning like sleepy suns against the walls. The workshop was open and broad, scattered with heavy benches, wooden hubs, steaming cauldrons, and iron tires stacked like giant bracelets. Logs of ash, elm, and oak lay seasoned and split. A long pit might run the length of the yard, where wagon axles were carved and wheels were tested for their role. The space was part forge, part carpenter's den. And above it all, the scent of wood smoke and beeswax lingered like old memory. A wheelwright's day began with wood, selecting, shaping, and planning. Each task was heavy with labor and care, shaping the hood and hub, the center of every wheel, carving spokes, tapered and measured with precision, crafting the felloes, curved wooden sections forming the rim, fitting the iron tire, heated red hot, then quenched to shrink around the wheel, assembling and testing, ensuring perfect roundness and strength, repairing broken carts, wagons, and barrows. The work required strength, patience, and an unerring eye, for a single misalignment could shatter under load. A good wheel could last for years, or break within a mile, depending on the maker's hand. The hub, often made of elm for its strength, had to be bored clean and true. Spokes, usually ash, had to fit tight without cracking. The outer rim, or felloe, was formed in arcs, joined in a circle, and bound with an iron tire. This tire was heated in a fire until it glowed red, then quickly hammered onto the wooden rim. As it cooled, it shrank, locking the wheel together with a hiss of steam and smoke. It was a dramatic moment. The forge roaring, the wheel spinning, fire and water sealing the wheel's fate. The wheelwright served every corner of society. Peasants came with hand carts and plow carts needing repairs before market day. Merchants needed sturdy wagons for trade. Nobles demanded carriages, not just functional, but elegant, smooth, and silent. Even kings relied on wheelwrights. In great households, they were retained on estates, ready to build or fix carts that carried everything from wine to weaponry. In armies, a broken wheel could stall a march. A wheelwright might travel with troops, mending wagons, fixing siege gear, or building new transport on the fly. No journey could begin without him. A wheelwright's craft took years to master. A young boy might begin as an apprentice, sweeping the yard and fetching water. He'd learn to read grain patterns in wood, shape with draw knife and adze, and measure spokes by feel. His hands would ache, his knuckles would split, but over time he'd learn the music of turning things true. Essential tools included the spoke shave and draw knife for shaping, the auger for drilling hubs, the compass and calipers for measurement, the tire bender and anvil for shaping iron, the hooping pit, where wheels were fixed and tested. It was a craft of many parts: wood, iron, fire, and sweat, all moving as one. Though he rarely wore fine clothes or walked in noble halls, the wheelwright was deeply respected. Villagers called on him as a matter of necessity. Merchants relied on him to keep their fortunes rolling. Priests and bakers, smiths and shepherds all turned to him when the wheel cracked or the cart leaned. In towns, wheelwrights often joined the Carpenters' Guild or had their own associations. Some worked closely with blacksmiths. Others were also cartwrights, building entire wagons from frame to wheel. He didn't travel far, but his wheels did, across kingdoms, through forests, into battle and home again. As the sun dipped low, the wheelwright wiped sawdust from his brow and cooled the forge. Wheels leaned gently along the walls, glowing softly in the dusk. His tools were hung on iron nails. The smell of scorched wood lingered in the air. Perhaps a wagon was ready for the next day's journey. Perhaps a noble's carriage was complete. Or perhaps only a single wheel had been mended, but it would carry bread to market or firewood to a hearth. And as the stars rose, the wheelwright rested, knowing that someone, somewhere, would move forward tomorrow because of his craft. He did not ride the wagons. He did not wear the silks, but he made the journey possible. In every cart that creaked over cobble, in every carriage that rolled through castle gates, in every wheel that turned beneath sun or snow, the wheelwright's hands were there. Part carpenter, part smith, part silent architect of motion, he shaped the paths of medieval life, not with words, but with wood and iron. And though his name is seldom sung, his work still echoes in every turning wheel that carries us forward.
In a time when every thread was spun by hand, every tunic woven by toil, there stood the weaver, silent behind their loom, shaping not only garments, but the very fabric of life. A weaver wasn't simply a maker of cloth. They were artisans of patience, of rhythm, of quiet beauty. From their hands came the cloaks of peasants and the robes of kings. They clothed monks, merchants, midwives, and nobles alike. In a world without factories, each thread tells a story, and the weaver wove them all. Step into a medieval weaver's cottage or town workshop. A large wooden loom dominates the space. Tall and creaking, its threads taut like the strings of an unseen harp. Baskets of wool, flax, and dyed yarn line the walls. Spindles rest on benches. A small fire glows in the hearth, used to warm water and soften fibers. There's a rhythm in the air, the steady beat of the shuttle, the soft creak of wood, the whisper of thread being born into fabric. The room smells of lanolin, sun-dried linen, and sometimes fermented dyes. It is not loud, it is not fast, but it is alive. A weaver's work began at dawn and ended only when the light grew too dim to thread the needle. Each day brought a mix of tasks: spinning raw wool or flax into thread, stretching yarn onto the loom, a careful, time-consuming task, weaving fabric row by row with a hand-thrown shuttle, adjusting tension and fixing snags, washing, drying, and sometimes dyeing finished cloth, preparing bolts for sale or trade at the next town market. A skilled weaver could produce a few yards a day. It was not speed that defined their craft, it was steadiness. Weaving was one part of a long chain loop. Wool had to be sheared, washed, carded, and spun. Linen came from flax, soaked and broken, then beaten into thread. Only then could the weaver begin. In many homes, families worked together. One spun, one dyed, one wove. Children learned to sort fibers before they could write their names. Cloth types varied: coarse wool for peasants, fine linen for priests, dyed and patterned fabrics for nobility. Tapestries, too, were woven, telling stories across entire walls. Each thread was precious. Nothing was wasted, and everything was made by hand. Cloth was as essential as food, and just as telling of one's status. The poor wore undyed wool or plain brown linen. Merchants and guildsmen favored deeper hues, forest green, deep red, navy. Nobles, ever watchful of fashion, demanded fine weaves, imported silks, and golden embroidery. Weavers worked for all of them. Some ran small home workshops, others were part of weavers' guilds in bustling cities like Ghent, Bruges, and London. In wealthy towns, guild weavers were respected. In villages, they were one of the most important trades. Everyone needed clothes, after all, and every piece began at the loom. Weaving was a learned art. A young apprentice might begin by carding wool or spinning thread. Slowly, they'd learn to warp a loom, a complex task of threading hundreds of yarns in precise order. Only later would they begin to weave. Tools of the trade included the loom, large wooden and often custom-built, the shuttle, used to pass thread back and forth, combs or beaters to tighten each row of weave, shears, spindles, and winding frames. Natural dyes, like woad, madder, walnut, and saffron. Weaving was meticulous. A single error early on could ruin days of work. But a skilled weaver knew their loom like a musician knows their instrument, and played it with the same quiet devotion. The weaver stood between peasant and merchant, part craftsman, part artist. In towns, they might grow prosperous through guild protection and regular trade. A talented weaver could take commissions from noble houses or the church, creating altar cloths, vestments, or tapestries. In villages, they were vital. They repaired torn clothing, bartered cloth for grain or cheese, and brought news from nearby towns when they traveled for wool or dye. Respected, but rarely wealthy. Necessary, but rarely praised. Yet without them, no one was clothed. Not the knight, not the nun, not the newborn. As the sun dipped low, the weaver tied off their work and stilled the loom. The cloth was folded, warm from the day's touch. Spools were gathered. The floor was swept by scattered wool. A candle was lit, casting golden light over threads that shimmered like quiet rainbows. Perhaps a child slept beneath a newly woven blanket. Perhaps a bolt of fabric would journey to a tailor in the morning. Perhaps a robe was finished, meant for a bishop or a bride. And as the hearth grew dim, the weaver rested, hands tired but heart steady. For tomorrow the thread will call again. They did not ride into battle, they did not stand in court, but the weaver shaped every cloak, every tunic, every veil. Their hands moved with patience, their lives followed the rhythm of the loom. Quiet, steady, unseen, but never unneeded. In every thread of history, their work endures. From the rough tunic of the field worker to the silk-draped shoulders of kings. Half artisan, half storyteller. A maker of warmth in a cold world. The weaver, tying past to present, stitch by stitch.
In a world before printing presses and mass-produced books, knowledge moved slowly, by hand, line by line, ink upon parchment. And at the quiet heart of this movement sat the scribe, patient, precise, and often unseen. He was more than a writer. He was a preserver of memory, a guardian of law, a servant of God's word, and a bridge between silence and story. Whether copying sacred texts or recording market ledgers, the scribe's pen shaped the very soul of the Middle Ages. In candlelight and stillness, he wrote the world. Step into the scriptorium, the scribe's workplace. It is quiet, deeply so. Only the soft scratch of quill on parchment breaks the hush. Rows of wooden desks, angled for light, line the walls. A high window lets in the sun, just enough to guide the eye without straining it. Candles flicker. Sand is sprinkled to dry ink. Shelves bear rolls of vellum, bottles of pigment, and leather-bound tomes waiting to be born. In monasteries, the scriptorium was a sacred space, where writing was prayer. In towns, it was a place of record, contract, and coin. In either way, it was a place of deep focus and deeper patience. A scribe's day often began before sunrise with prayer or ritual, especially in religious scriptoria. Then came the tools, ink mixed, pens cut, parchment prepared. His daily duties included copying religious texts, psalms, and scriptures, recording legal documents, land deeds, and wills, translating works from Latin, Greek, or Arabic, illuminating initials with gold leaf or pigment, maintaining town records or merchant accounts, teaching writing to noble children or apprentices. Every stroke of the quill mattered. A single blot could mar a whole page. A misspelled word could alter meaning, even belief. It was not fast, but it was forever. The scribe's tools were simple, but sacred. Quills, usually goose or swan feathers, trimmed and sharpened daily. Ink, made from oak gall, iron salts, and wine. Parchment, calf, sheep, or goat skin, stretched and scraped smooth. Rulers and compasses for straight lines and margins. Knives to scrape away errors gently. Sand or blotting cloths to dry ink. Gold leaf and pigment for illumination when allowed. Each manuscript might take months. Some were simple. Some, like illuminated gospels, were breathtaking, filled with color, vines, and fantastical beasts hiding in letters. But every word, plain or precious, began the same way, by hand. Scribes served many masters and purposes. In monasteries, they were monks, copying holy texts, commentaries, and hymns for posterity and prayer. Their writing was worship. In royal courts, they were clerks and secretaries, trusted with correspondence, treaties, and court records. Some were spies in ink, reporting in code. In towns, scribes served merchants, lawyers, and notaries, drawing up contracts, recording marriages, and even writing love letters for those who could not. In cathedrals, they worked under bishops, preserving ecclesiastical law and ancient texts. Though rarely famous, scribes were essential. Every decree, law, poem, and gospel passed through their hands. A scribe's path began in youth, often under a priest, monk, or teacher. They learned not only to write, but to read Latin, count in Roman numerals, and form letters with grace and clarity. Good handwriting wasn't just art, it was law, theology, memory. Temperament mattered too. Patience in long silent hours, precision in lines and grammar. Humility, the words were not their own. Faithfulness, especially when copying sacred or royal text. Errors were often punished. Mastery came slowly, but once attained, the scribe's hand could shape law, legacy, and literature. The scribe lived between worlds, not a noble, not a laborer. In towns, they were educated and respected, often aligned with the church or guilds. A good scribe might earn steady pay or even royal patronage. A few traveled with armies, recording battles or treaties. In monasteries, their names were often lost, but sometimes, at the very end of a manuscript, one might write, "Pray for me, the humble scribe, who toiled at this work." Their craft was quiet. Their impact is immense. Without them, history would fade. Languages would vanish. Thought itself would be lost in time. As twilight came, the scribe gently blotted his last line. He set down his quill, closed the inkpot, and stretched fingers sore from repetition. He might roll up a scroll, bind a parchment stack, or add the finishing mark to a gilded amen. Candles were snuffed one by one. The scriptorium darkened. Outside, the world bustled, carts rolling, markets closing, prayers being sung. But inside, something eternal had been added to the world. A word, a thought, a truth. Carried forward not by voice, but by ink. He wore no armor, held no sword, and built no walls. But the scribe preserved what others only lived. Half scholar, half artisan, a servant of silence, of symbols, of memory. In every book we open, in every word passed down, his presence lingers. In steady script, in careful lines, in the breath between history and forgetting. Though he lived behind closed doors and beneath quiet roofs, his words walked centuries. And Still, they do. In the heart of the medieval world, where knights rode under banners and danger loomed on dusty roads, there stood the armorer. Not a warrior, yet a maker of war. Not a noble, yet entrusted with king's protection. He was half blacksmith, part artist, part engineer. From his forge came the breastplates of knights, the helms of squires, and the mail shirts worn beneath royal robes. Steel was his language, fire his companion, protection his quiet promise. Step into an armorer's workshop and you'd be greeted by heat and noise, the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil, the hiss of quenched steel, the heavy scent of soot and sweat. Suits of armor hang from wooden pegs, helms glint in firelight, racks of tongs, hammers, and chisels line the walls. A forge glows red in the corner, pulsing like a heartbeat. Leather aprons hang beside coats of mail, chalk drawings of measurements scrawl across old planks, and beside it all, a small wooden desk where scrolls and wax seals record the names of lords and battles past. It is a place of both craft and quiet power. The armorer's day began before the sun, with coals lit and bellows blown. His daily tasks included heating and shaping raw steel into plates and forms, crafting mail by hand, ring by ring, measuring knights for custom-fit harnesses and helms, riveting joints for mobility in battle, polishing armor with ash, vinegar, and cloth, etching crests and religious symbols onto shields or breastplates. Each suit of armor could take weeks, sometimes months to perfect. It was not just protection, it was identity, pride, and in many cases, survival. The armorer transformed simple metal into moving art. A helmet wasn't just a dome, it had to breathe, turn, and deflect a blade. A breastplate wasn't just a slab, it had to curve with the chest, bear a lance's blow, and never pinch the rider's breath. Mail required thousands of interlocked rings, each riveted by hand. Gauntlets needed to flex like fingers, yet withstand the crush of a mace. And above all, every piece had to balance protection with motion. For what good was armor if it weighed you down before the battle even began? The armorer served every rank of soldier. A squire might only afford a mail shirt and a kettle helm. A foot soldier perhaps just greaves or a reinforced cap. But a wealthy knight, he would want the full suit: breastplate, vambrace, sabaton, sallet, and more. Nobles sent detailed orders requesting specific engravings, family crests, or exotic designs. Monarchs employed master armorers within their castles, forging armor for tournaments, campaigns, and royal guards. And after each battle, squires and messengers arrived with damaged gear, scorched, dented, pierced, and the armorer, like a quiet healer, set it all right again. No one became an armorer quickly. Training began as a blacksmith's apprentice. Only after years of shaping tools, horseshoes, and nails would one specialize in arms and armor. Knowledge of metallurgy, knowing when to quench, temper, and fold. Mastery of tools, hammer, anvil, drift, swage block. Precision in fitting, measuring joints, shoulders, and spines. Artistic touch for embossing, engraving, and etching. Tools of the trade included bellows-fed forge, anvils with curved horns, hammers in many weights, punches and chisels, leather straps, rivets and buckles, stones and cloth for polishing, and always fire. In towns with guilds, master armorers held high respect. They trained apprentices, submitted their best work for inspection, and earned their seal, a mark stamped into steel. They worked closely with weaponsmiths, leatherworkers, and tailors, for a suit of armor was half steel, half skin, half garment. Some armorers rose high, commissioned by kings, traveling to foreign courts, even accompanying crusades. Their name might be etched beneath the shoulder of a prince's cuirass. And yet most remained humble, soot-faced, steady-handed, listening to the stories of war through scorched steel and split mail. As twilight fell, the forge dimmed, sparks slowed, steel cooled. The armorer wiped his brow, hung his hammer, and polished the final plate until it caught the candlelight like moonlight on a lake. Perhaps he laid out a newly finished helm for a young knight's first battle. Perhaps he repaired a father's armor so his son might wear it next. Perhaps he simply sat, hands aching, beside the fire, watching the glow flicker across the shields he had shaped. And though he did not wear the armor himself, he had stood between blade and heart more times than any sword had swung. He did not charge into battle, but he kept the warriors safe. He shaped no speeches, claimed no glory, and rode no stallion, but in his hands courage took form. Steel folded into strength, leather into legacy, iron into honor. Half craftsman, half guardian, a silent shield behind the shield, and though the clang of his hammer has long gone quiet, his legacy remains. In every museum's breastplate, in every story of knighthood, and in every quiet craftsman who shapes protection from fire and flame.